Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, my own daughter walked down the aisle with a man who once called me nothing more than the wallet, and I sat there, smiling on the outside, but hollow on the inside, while everyone else cheered and clapped like this was the picture of a perfect family. I had spent months handling the details no one likes to talk about: deposits, contracts, liability insurance, parking permits, and the kind of boring but expensive things that make the difference between a smooth event and a disaster. I paid for the venue, I prepaid the catering minimum, I covered the security, and every single one of those checks cleared from my account. But when the big moment came, the stepfather took my place, held her arm, and strutted toward the altar like he had built her childhood with his own two hands. And me? They placed me in a seat off to the side, far enough that I wasn't even visible in the photos being staged for social media. I sat there in that chair listening to people whisper about how beautiful the couple looked, and I thought about all the nights I worked double shifts when she was little so she could have braces, about the time I sold my car so I could pay for her first semester of college, and about the years I fought with school boards, doctors, and landlords to make sure she had what she needed. But apparently none of that was glamorous enough to earn me the title of parent at the ceremony. Instead, Evan, the polished man my ex married after me, was treated like the father who raised her, and Dan, my ex, basked in the glow of being the fun dad who showed up only when there was an audience. I wanted to stand up and scream that I was the one who paid for everything, that the napkins they were crying into were bought with my overtime paychecks, but I stayed quiet because I didn't want to ruin her moment, even if my own heart felt like it was being scraped raw. During the reception, I noticed little details that confirmed what I had already suspected. Evan was directing the coordinator like he had signed the checks. Kara, his sister, was bragging about how she had set up the cash fund for gifts. And someone had changed the alcohol package without telling me. I had deliberately kept the open bar to avoid the nightmare of people drinking themselves stupid on my dime. But suddenly there was champagne flowing like water and shots being carried around as if this was some Vegas bachelor party. I pulled up the venue portal on my phone under the table, and sure enough, the contract had been modified, and guess whose card was still listed to cover the difference? Mine. I sat there swallowing cake in fury, calculating how many thousands that little stunt would cost me, while Kara took selfies with guests and tagged the event as if she had financed the whole thing. Dan gave a speech that made my teeth hurt. He talked about how proud he was of Maya, how he always knew she would grow into a strong woman, and how grateful he was that she had Evan to guide her. He made it sound like I was a footnote in her life, like the only thing I had ever contributed was money, and even then, not in a meaningful way. I wanted to laugh, because the truth was he never paid child support on time, and Evan had never once been the one who picked up the phone when the school nurse called, but I kept my face still. I had learned a long time ago that letting men like that see you break was the only way they ever felt powerful. I watched my daughter smile at them, and I told myself she wasn't smiling because she agreed. She was smiling because she didn't want to cause a scene. And maybe I was lying to myself, maybe she really believed their version of the story, but I couldn't risk breaking her heart in the middle of her wedding. Still, I knew one thing for sure. I was not going to sit quietly and let them run up bills on my card, not when I had already been shoved into the role of silent benefactor. So when dessert was served and most people were distracted by music, I quietly logged into the venue portal again and reverted the open bar extension to the original package. The system automatically rerouted the overages to the secondary card on file, which, funny enough, belonged to Evan. I closed my phone, sipped my coffee, and for the first time that day, I felt like I could breathe. People might think that was petty, but you need to understand, this wasn't about money. It was about boundaries. It was about being told to sit down and shut up while other people stole my place and pretended I never existed. By flipping that one little switch, I wasn't taking away her wedding. I was just making sure I didn't pay to fund their fantasy of erasing me. Let Evan and Dan cover the excess liquor bill. They were the ones throwing themselves a party, not me. As the night wore on, I kept my mask in place, clapped when I was supposed to clap, and hugged people who barely remembered my name, but inside I was already setting lines. They could call me the wallet, but I was going to decide when and how that wallet opened. I didn't tell Maya about what I had done. I didn't want to taint her night with my bitterness. But I knew the truth would surface soon enough. By the time the after-party kicked off and people were stumbling toward the dance floor, the system had already processed the change. The excess charges were no longer mine to swallow, and when Evan signed the final papers with the coordinator, his signature sealed the deal. I walked out quietly, drove home in silence, and for once, slept like a rock. Because I knew this was just the beginning, and the real story was going to start the very next morning. By the time the after-party started, the card on file wasn't mine anymore. And I slept like a rock. The next morning started with that kind of quiet that makes you think the world has paused out of pity, and then my phone began lighting up with message after message from Maya, each one more broken than the last. And I sat at my kitchen table listening to my child cry in my ear while she tried to make sense of a night that looked like a dream on camera but felt like a trap from the inside. She said she had barely closed the door of the getaway car when Tyler started demanding to know why the envelope count looked off, and when she tried to say that people are not walking cash machines and maybe the point of a wedding is not to break even like a retail sale. He turned it into a spreadsheet fight, after which Evan stepped in with that smooth tone he uses when he is about to bulldoze someone, saying he would take it from here because she was emotional and needed rest, which is a phrase men lean on whenever a woman has the nerve to be a person with opinions. She tried to thank me in her toast and got a cold glance from Evan that said she was embarrassing him by dragging paperwork into a fairy tale, and before the night ended she was told that the fund was fully managed and the photos would be professionally curated, which sounded harmless until you realized every one of those words translated to a door being locked with her on the wrong side. I kept listening without interrupting her messages, because sometimes you do not fix a fire by throwing yourself into it. You fix it by finding the gas line and turning the valve, and I knew those valves by heart because I had installed them. So after I heard the part where she apologized for not insisting I walk with her, and the part where she said she felt like a prop in her own movie, I did not grab my keys and drive across town to stage a tearful rescue. I opened my laptop and typed the photographer's name, and then I reread a very boring line in a very boring contract that said the gallery could not be made public or duplicated without the written approval of the payer of record, which happened to be me. Because I was the one who had cut the retainer check months ago when everyone else was still debating color palettes and hashtags. It is not romantic to say that a parent's love sometimes looks like a file folder, but if you have ever survived a divorce, then you know the quiet power of a clause that never needed to shout to be real. So I drafted a short and painfully polite note thanking the photographer for her artistry and reminding her that no publication, preview, or sneak peek could proceed without my confirmation, especially while there was a question about the rightful owner of the cash fund's beneficiary account, and I set it to send at a reasonable hour so she would not feel ambushed, because professionals deserve respect even when they are in the middle of someone else's family storm. Then I called the registry platform, which is a sentence that should come with a medal, because nothing kills faith in humanity faster than a customer support menu on a Sunday morning, but I did it anyway. And I asked a question that sounded dumb on purpose, which is a trick I learned the hard way, because when you present as a harmless woman with a small confusion, people explain more than they intend to, and within minutes a very cheerful voice told me that yes, the cash fund disperses to the email address listed under the organizer account, and yes, that address could be Kara's if she was the one who set it up, and yes, changes required consent from the organizer or proof of ownership by the beneficiary, and no, they did not have proof that the bride had ever been made the primary, which meant that generous relatives had been pouring money into a bucket that was not actually tied to my daughter. It was tied to Kara's inbox and whatever management agreement Evan had whispered about during planning meetings that I had not been invited to attend. I thanked the rep, requested an account review citing a beneficiary discrepancy, and filed a support ticket that politely attached screenshots of the invitations where the fund was pitched as a direct gift to Maya, which made the platform's legal department sit up and read the fine print the way I had done at the kitchen table when I was too angry to chew breakfast. I did not tell Maya any of this while she was still crying into my voicemail stack, because she did not need tactics when her nervous system was tapped out. She needed a mother who believed her pain without cross-examining it. So I sent back one short promise that said I was here and she was not crazy and she did not have to make any big decisions today. And then I turned back to my screen because love can hold a hand and hold a line at the same time. I added one more quiet move that felt almost petty, but was actually protective. I asked the photographer to remove the stepfather from the early curation queue under the clause that specified client point of contact, which again was me. And I explained that the bride would approve selections when she was rested and in full control of the account that represented her identity, and if anyone had a question they could email me and copy the coordinator, who already knew which name had cleared the bank. By late morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Evan that read like a corporate memo with perfume on it, and he told me, in the sweetest possible way, to stay out of matters I did not understand, which almost made me laugh out loud. Because there is nothing funnier than a man with a spreadsheet lecturing the woman who built the credit score those contracts were printed on. Yet I did not take the bait, because when you are in a house made of glass, the smartest revenge is to let sunlight do the breaking. I forwarded his message to my email, archived it in a folder with a tidy name, and made coffee, the good kind, because you deserve something decent when you are navigating a maze built by people who think kindness is weakness. And then I waited. Not passively, but with the confidence of someone who knows where the exits are and which lights she can turn off without anyone noticing until the room gets very, very dark. Around midday, Maya finally called instead of sending voice notes, and she told me she had slept for maybe an hour and kept waking up with that crushed feeling you get after a fight that is not finished, and she asked a question that told me a door had opened inside her. Because she wanted to know whether the photos could be delayed, so she did not have to watch a highlight reel of a day that did not belong to her, and I said yes, and I told her it was already handled, and I heard the air leave her chest in a way that sounded like relief and grief tied together with a shaking thread. We did not talk about the fund in detail because I wanted her to have one clean win before we waded into mud, so I brought up breakfast and hydration and the tiny fact that she had done nothing wrong except try to please people who treat gratitude like a leash. And when we hung up, she knew two things she had not known when she woke up. Her images were safe, and her mother was not a wallet. Her mother was a lock. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed again, only this time it was not Maya. It was the photographer forwarding me a voicemail from Evan asking for immediate gallery access and threatening to escalate. And all she wrote above the audio was a single line that made me grin into my mug even though I was bone-tired. Per our contract, I will await your written approval. When Maya finally gathered enough courage to meet me in person, it was not in some dramatic confrontation, but in the most ordinary way imaginable, a small cafe that smelled of burnt espresso and disinfectant wipes. And she looked like someone who had not slept in days, her makeup from the wedding long gone and her voice cracked from repeating apologies she thought she owed me. She slid a folded paper across the table, and before she even said a word, I could feel my chest tighten because I knew that whatever she was about to hand me was not going to be small. It was the prenuptial agreement, the very one Evan and Tyler had presented to her at nearly midnight before the wedding, slipped in under the excuse that everyone does this now and it is just a formality. She told me she had signed because Evan insisted, and Tyler sat there silent, nodding like a puppet, while she was half drunk from the rehearsal dinner and terrified of looking like a problem bride. She whispered that she barely read the pages, only the line Evan pointed at, where she had to initial, and she hated herself for not stopping, but she thought the whole marriage would collapse if she didn't comply, because that is exactly how they staged it. I opened the pages and read carefully, line by line, the way I had taught myself to read contracts years ago after Dan left and I was suddenly both provider and protector, forced to learn the language of loopholes while he floated through life without consequence. This so-called prenup was not neutral, it was a trap dressed up as protection. It secured every asset in Tyler's name, locked away any earnings during the marriage under his control, and limited Maya to scraps if things ever fell apart. It was not a partnership document, it was a muzzle. I did not shout, because shouting would only make her shrink further into her chair, but inside I was boiling. I asked her quietly if she had her own lawyer present when she signed, and when she shook her head no, I felt both fury and opportunity surge through me. Because what they had staged might look official, but legality has rules, and one of those rules is that coercion, intoxication, and absence of independent counsel can render documents contestable, especially when signed under duress less than 24 hours before a wedding. I told her we were not going to panic, we were going to be precise. I reminded her that just because men in suits say something is binding does not mean it is permanent. I pulled out my phone and called an old friend from my HR days, a woman who had survived her own brutal divorce and had built a side career teaching others how to recognize legal traps. She did not need to read the whole document to know the strategy. She only needed the date, the hour of signing, and the absence of counsel. She told me we had a narrow window to challenge, to put the agreement under review, and to stop any immediate enforcement. It would not erase the marriage, but it would take the loaded gun off the table. Meanwhile, I knew the money stream was still bleeding somewhere else. The registry platform had responded to my ticket, asking for proof that Maya was supposed to be the beneficiary, and I sent them screenshots of invitations, texts where relatives had been told gifts would go directly to the couple, and my original receipt from the platform that clearly referenced gifts to the bride and groom. I worded it carefully, not as an angry mother, but as a consumer citing a misrepresentation, which is a language companies take very seriously when fraud might be lurking in their systems. Within an hour, they froze disbursements pending review, which meant Kara could no longer siphon money quietly while Maya sat in a fog of guilt and exhaustion. It was not about the cash itself, it was about taking back what had been marketed as hers and blocking the narrative that Evan and his sister controlled every lever. When Maya asked me what I had done, I kept it simple. I told her she had time now, time to think without being bulldozed, and that nothing would move until she decided where she wanted to stand. She looked like someone who had been handed oxygen after nearly drowning, and she whispered, "But what if they hate me for this?" I leaned in and told her the truth she had avoided for years. That love which collapses the moment you set a boundary is not love, it is a leash. And if they hated her for protecting herself, then maybe the problem was never her resistance, but their need for control. Later that night, Dan sent me a message from the number he uses when he wants to play the busy executive, and the words were as predictable as the sunrise. "You're poisoning her against us. She was fine before you got involved." I stared at the screen and felt a flash of bitter humor, because fine to him meant exhausted, silenced, and funneled into contracts she never wanted. I did not reply, because I had already learned that fighting with men like him is like wrestling smoke. Instead, I forwarded the message to my HR friend, and she wrote back with a 3-sentence draft I almost wanted to frame. "Your client signed a document without counsel, under duress, and within an unreasonable timeline. We're asserting her right to review and rescind under state law. Kindly refrain from further intimidation." I copied the text into an email for Maya to send under her own name, because the only way this fight mattered was if her voice carried it. That night, for the first time since the wedding, Maya texted me not with apologies, but with a single line that told me something had shifted. She wrote, "I don't feel powerless anymore." And I sat back in my chair, phone in hand, and let myself feel something close to relief, because I knew this was not the end of the battle, but it was the first step where my daughter stopped being a prop in their show and started being the author of her own story. And while the world outside still thought they were the perfect couple, I knew the truth was now on paper, with signatures, dates, and enough leverage to crack their picture-perfect glass facade wide open. By the time the week rolled around and people had returned to their jobs, their homes, and their regular lives, the curated version of the wedding was already circulating online, plastered with captions about dreams coming true and families uniting. And the narrative being fed to the world was that Dan and Evan had given Maya her perfect day. It was polished, it was glamorous, and it was a complete fabrication of who had carried the weight and who had been erased. At first, I told myself I could ignore it because truth does not need constant advertisement, but then I started receiving texts from relatives and even a few coworkers who had been invited. asking why my name was not mentioned in any of the thank you posts, asking if I had even attended, and one person even wrote that they assumed I had contributed nothing. I read those words in disbelief, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed exactly how thoroughly the story had been hijacked. My contributions had been invisible on purpose, not by accident, and that invisibility was now being weaponized against me. Maya called me in tears when she realized the official wedding site had been updated with a long thank you note signed by Evan and Kara, a note that credited themselves and Dan for every aspect of the celebration while naming her only as the grateful bride. She told me she had not written a word of it and had not even seen it until it went live. That was the moment when I stopped hesitating. I pulled up the site's backend, where my login as financial administrator was still valid, and I added a single update that was dry, factual, and impossible to misinterpret. It read, "Thank you for your generosity. Please note that all fund disbursements are paused until the bride is confirmed as the sole beneficiary." I did not add drama, I did not accuse anyone, I simply drew a line of truth through a sea of curated lies, and then I logged out and waited. Within hours my phone began buzzing again, but this time the tone was entirely different. Instead of whispers about my absence, I started receiving messages from family members thanking me for the clarification, asking how they could ensure their contributions reached Maya directly, and in some cases attaching screenshots of the receipts they had already received from the platform. Some even asked if they should request refunds and redirect the money through another route. It was as if one small line of honesty had unlocked a door, and people rushed to walk through it. Maya was startled, almost panicked, because she had spent so long being told that the only safe way to survive was to smile and comply, but when she saw the way relatives rallied behind her once they realized what was happening, her voice cracked with something that sounded like relief disguised as fear. Kara, on the other hand, did not stay quiet for long. She blasted out a group message claiming the update was fraudulent, insisting that the platform was being misused, and framing herself as the victim of sabotage. But the problem with lying to people who keep their receipts is that those receipts eventually speak louder than your posts. Guests began forwarding her claims to me, asking for verification, and all I had to do was show them the copy of the contract that tied the platform to Maya and the invitation that had been sent under her name. I never insulted Kara, I never stooped to her level of hysteria. I simply gave people the documents that matched their memory of what they had been promised. Watching her narrative collapse under the weight of her own arrogance was a kind of satisfaction I cannot put into simple words, because it was not loud and it was not flashy, but it was final in the way a door slams shut. Meanwhile, the photographer contacted me to confirm that she had frozen the gallery, per my written instruction, and she added a sentence that made me feel like I had chosen the right ally without even realizing it. She said, "I only release work to the client who paid. That's you, and unless the bride says otherwise, no one else gets access." It was the cleanest possible blow against the illusion that Evan controlled the optics. Without those photos, the entire performance began to crumble because social media thrives on images, not speeches, and if the images were locked away, all they had left were empty captions. I knew I had to take one more step, one that was sharper and riskier, but it had to be done with care. I sat down with a stack of thank you cards and began writing each one by hand, not with anger but with clarity. In each note, I expressed gratitude for the guests' generosity, included a copy of their own receipt, and added a single line that said, "If you prefer, you can redirect your gift to Maya's emergency fund account, which she alone controls." I mailed them without fanfare, no social media posts, no announcements, just direct truth placed into the hands of the people who mattered most. By doing this, I not only redirected resources back to her, I also dismantled the illusion that Evan or Kara could use those gifts as leverage. The money would either stay frozen in limbo or return directly to the person it was meant for, and either way, it was no longer under their control. By the end of the week, I received a voicemail that summed up exactly how far the tide had turned. It was from Evan, though it had been forwarded to me by the photographer, because he had mistakenly thought he could pressure her into releasing the gallery. His voice was clipped, frustrated, and full of that simmering arrogance that had once intimidated everyone around him. He said, "You need to stop interfering. This is not your role, and if you keep blocking access, there will be consequences." The photographer, God bless her, simply added a note when she sent it to me. "Per our contract, I will await your written approval." That line was worth more than any public victory, because it meant the walls were closing in, not around me, but around the people who had spent so long pretending they owned every narrative. I sat there with the voicemail playing on repeat, not because I needed to memorize his words, but because I wanted to savor the shift in tone. He was no longer in control. He was no longer dictating terms. He was begging, even if he tried to disguise it as a threat. And I realized then that revenge does not always come in fireworks or grand confrontations. Sometimes revenge is as quiet as a locked door, as boring as a contract clause, and as undeniable as the truth staring back from a receipt. They had wanted me erased, reduced to nothing but the wallet, but the irony was that the very paperwork they had tried to bury me under had become the blade that cut them down. By dinner, Evan wasn't calling me anymore. He was calling the photographer. And the photographer sent me the voicemail. The day after the voicemail made its pathetic loop through my phone, I decided that waiting for them to behave with decency was a fantasy I could no longer afford, and if I wanted my daughter to have room to think, I had to manufacture that room myself. Which meant closing doors they believed were theirs to swing open whenever they pleased and handing Maya a set of keys that only fit in her hands. I started with something that would look petty from the outside, but was, in truth, a lifeline disguised as bureaucracy. I called the travel agency handling the honeymoon and, with the confirmation codes I had paid for, transferred every reservation into Maya's name alone, locking out anyone else from making changes or pulling itineraries, and then I added one more thing that no one could see on a glossy feed. A fully flexible return ticket sitting in her account with an open date. A way out if she needed it, no explanations required, no committee vote, just a door she could walk through. Without asking permission, I sent her the login and told her that the trip was hers, whether she took it with a husband, a friend, or a book, and that there would be no questions and no guilt from me, because the gift was not a vacation, the gift was choice. Next, I went through what was left of the vendor credits, the boring leftovers that people forget after the confetti, which in our case meant venue deposits that had rolled forward and a rental company credit from an overestimate. And I moved every cent into a new client account that required only the bride's explicit approval for release, which, again, made me the villain in their story and the guardian in the one that actually mattered. When the coordinator called to ask why the access list had changed, I told her calmly that it was standard risk management while the beneficiary question was under review, and I could almost hear the moment she remembered who had signed the checks, because her tone shifted from cautious to cooperative, and she asked where she could send the updated forms for Maya's signature. We completed them that afternoon, in my kitchen, with tea going cold on the counter, while Maya read every line out loud, slowly, like someone learning to trust her own voice for the first time. The fun dispute moved faster than I expected, not because the platform cared about our family drama, but because companies care about liability when consumers can produce proof that marketing promises were not matched by account structures. And my little stack of screenshots and receipts did not tell a sad story, it told a clear one. Disbursements stayed frozen, requests for chargebacks began to surface from a few guests who felt misled. And the platform's compliance team sent a curt message asking for confirmation that the bride had been added as the sole beneficiary before any funds could be released. I did not cheer, because this was not a parade, it was the slow untying of knots that had been pulled tight on purpose, but I felt something like quiet vindication, the kind that does not need applause because the point is not to be seen, the point is to be free. Maya and I talked late into the night about the prenup, the photographs, the money, and the marriage, and I did what is hardest for a mother who has been pushed aside and mocked as a wallet. I stopped talking long enough to hear the part she could barely say. She told me that Tyler kept asking why she was letting me interfere, why she was making everything complicated, and when she tried to explain that she just wanted access to what had been advertised as hers, he said that Evan knew best, and that she should be grateful someone else was willing to handle the stress. I asked her to imagine a future where every disagreement got routed through the person who had cut her out of her own wedding walkway, and then I asked her to imagine a different future where the only people at the table were the two of them, with no one else holding a leash disguised as a spreadsheet, and I told her that whichever future she chose, I would love her in it, even if it broke my heart, but I would not pretend that being managed is the same thing as being loved. The next morning, I wrote the cleanest email of my life, short enough to read on a screen without scrolling and sharp enough to cut through a week of performance. I addressed the photographer, the registry platform, the coordinator, and the travel agency, copied Dan and Evan so there would be no whispered misunderstandings, and I wrote that, as the payer of record and on behalf of the bride with her written consent attached, all assets and media would remain on hold until the bride confirmed sole control, and that any attempt to publish, disperse, or alter without her explicit approval would be reported as fraud, not because I liked the word, but because it was the accurate one. I thanked everyone for their professionalism. I attached the letters that triggered the prenup review period, and I closed with a single sentence that landed like a door latch sliding into place. The client is the bride. There was noise after that, of course there was, men who had mistaken volume for authority making calls and sending messages, and trying to spin this as hysteria, as sabotage, as me being bitter, and I did not answer most of it. Because not every sound deserves a response, and the only person who needed my words was already sitting across from me, trying to decide what to do with the life she had just promised to build. I told her to take the week that was already paid for, to step away from the chorus and listen to the center of herself, to go to the ocean or the mountains or the quiet of a hotel room and ask one question without anyone else in the room. Is this a marriage or is this a management plan? She left with a small suitcase and a long breath, and I stayed home and folded laundry like a person who believes that ordinary tasks can hold extraordinary relief, because sometimes they can. On the third day, she called from the balcony of a place I could hear but could not see, and she told me she had asked Tyler to meet for one conversation, and when he arrived with a face full of hurt and a phone full of messages from Evan, she told him a single sentence that I had offered, but she had made her own. If I am just a product you are managing, then there is no marriage. He went quiet, and then he tried to bargain, and then he tried to blame, and when none of that worked, he said he needed time, and she said she had already taken hers, and that was the end of the only part one cared about, the part where she forgot her worth. When she came home, I did not celebrate, because this is not a story that ends with confetti or a dramatic soundtrack. This is a story that ends with a woman who was told she was a wallet and a daughter who was told she was a project, and both of them refusing to live inside those labels anymore. The photos will be released when she says so, the money will move when she says so, the paperwork will be signed when she says so, and the next time someone tries to walk her down a path while calling me names over their shoulder, she will not look around for permission or rescue. She will reach into her pocket and jingle the keys she owns. Do you know your true worth? My daughter does now, and I did not have to smash a glass or scream at a crowd to prove it. I just stopped paying for the story where we did not exist and wrote a better one with receipts, patience, and the kind of quiet that makes bullies hear themselves for the first time.